Welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights podcast, where we bring you ideas, experiences, and best practices from the real estate development industry. My name is Payam Nursalahi, and I'm the president of Janna Project Management, a construction and project management firm that helps real estate developers define, design, and deliver successful projects. I have two guests here today with me, and this episode we're going to be focusing on multiplexes in the city of Toronto, lessons learned, what we can do, and some practical advice. And in particular, we're going to talk a lot about the sixplexes. My guests for this episode are Samantha Eby. She's an architect and researcher based in Toronto. She's the co-founder and executive director of Rehousing, which is a nonprofit supporting housing creation through applied research, consultation, and education. Her work examines how design, policy, financing, and the ownership structures shape the built environment, with a focus on housing. She's received a whole bunch of rewards, and they've done a great job with their resource, which is free online. It's Rehousing, R-E-Housing, and we're going to dive into that in this episode. My second guest is Jana Levitt. Many of you have potentially heard of or have worked with her firm, LGA Architectural Partners. They work on very, very interesting projects. I'm sure if you go through their website, you're going to recognize many of their projects that are iconic. And I'm not going to go through on the list of all of those here. And one of the things that I'm very excited to have her here is that Janna is one of the pioneers when it comes to multiplexes. They started multiplex projects many years ago on their own as developer, designer, architect, investment, basically wearing all the hats. And she has very hands-on experience that she shares with us in this episode. So I hope you really enjoyed that conversation. As always, you can find all the relevant information for this episode and our guests on our website, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. Please remember to subscribe to the show. Even better, tell your friends, colleagues, and family about us and help us grow the show together. Thank you and enjoy listening. Jana and Sam, thank you very much for being here today. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Thanks for being here. And same to you, Sam. Why don't we start by you ladies give our audience a little bit of an introduction, where you come from, and I'll start with Jana and then we'll go to Sam.
Sure. So I'm Jana Levitt. I'm one of the partners at LGA Architectural Partners here in Toronto. We have a practice that is primarily working in the public sector, and we do a lot of multi-unit residential at a whole number of scales. One of the projects, and it's the project that really started off the relationship between Sam and Michael and I, where we all recognized we had similar interests, was a project called Ulster House, which was a purpose-built 5-unit multiplex condominium in the annex area, where we tore down a single-family house and put up a 5-plex. Apart from that, I'm also a part-time educator at a number of schools of architecture, and I think that's about it.
For the brief period that I've known you, Jana, I know that you're being very modest, but I'll leave that to the audience, and I'm sure they will gather from the conversation that we're going to have in the next little while. Sam, let's go to you. Who's Sam?
Yeah, so I'm Sam Eby. I'm an architect and researcher that's based in Toronto. I'm the executive director of Rehousing, which I co-founded with Jana Levitt and Michael Piper, who's not here with us today. And Rehousing is a not-for-profit organization that focuses on housing research and supporting housing development through that research, consultation, and education initiatives.
Perfect. You have a line on Rehousing website, which I think says you're trying to educate and empower citizen developers. Elaborate on that for us a little bit, please.
So all three of us came at this from a design background. And I think as designers, we have a sort of special set of skills in terms of being able to walk into a house and evaluate it and see its potential. And the more we were talking with people who were interested in pursuing these kinds of projects, whether they be multiplex conversions or small scale development, I think we were finding when we were taking on them ourselves, in the case of Jana and Michael, that even as someone who's trained and educated in the system, it's really complicated. And so if you don't have that background, it can be something that feels insurmountable to try and approach. And so I think a lot of the work came from two standpoints. One is trying to visualize what this could look like for people, because I think the idea of 4 units or 6 units on a single family house seemed scary at the beginning. And we wanted to show people what that could actually mean and look like so that they might envision themselves within that kind of framework. But then also to break down the process and try and make complex, confusing parts of it a little bit more legible.
If I can add to that, I think one of the interesting things and part of the connection to a citizen developer is, as we start to talk, we realize that this scale of development is actually possible for what we call a citizen developer, but it's filling a hole for one person or two people to start to be active in developing parts of the city that up until now you couldn't do. And we found that very exciting.
That's awesome. And that is very interesting that when I started doing my homework for this episode, going through the website and checking things out, which I have to admit I should have done years ago, but it's very similar or complementary to what we have been trying to do at midrise.ca and trying to enable, because our operating framework has been we need a small army of mid-rise developers throughout Canada to basically tackle this housing crisis. When that's why we're here. That's why we do this podcast as well. With that being said, let's talk about a few things. First of all, I have to say, anyone who hasn't checked your website, they have to go there and check it. And I'll leave it up to you to give the proper address and everything else. But correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think anyone has done this much research on this very particular topic of multiplexes in the city of Toronto as much as rehousing and your team has done. Is that correct?
Not that I'm aware of, but there have been tons of people who it's a pretty hot topic button issue. But I think what's been so exciting over the last few years is to see how many people are interested in it. I think we've taken a slightly different approach from a lot of other people who are interested in it and really focused on kind of the design driven aspect and branched out from there. But yeah, it's been nearly 4 years that we've been slowly building up the resources, which has been a kind of exciting journey.
Awesome. So I want to go through those steps, where the whole thing started, where we are right now, and where we're going to go. Again, my goal for this episode is, frankly, I'm going to be honest about it. I'm going to try and focus on the sixplex side, because when I sit down, and there is not a week that goes by that we don't have a conversation about a new project or someone who is outside of our realm or someone who's new to the industry, as you were explaining, a citizen developer is interested and they want to explore the opportunity of doing a new project, or they have a big bungalow house somewhere which they can split up and do that. I guess I'll go to you, Jana. From the very first step, I have a big bungalow house, maybe 80 feet frontage somewhere down one of these streets, like old school. And I'll leave it up to you to explain where those areas are. What are my first few steps that I need to start thinking about before I get myself fully involved in a full-scale development?
The first step, I think, is to think about whether you want to tear down the existing bungalow and build a new multiplex, or whether you want to do a renovation addition. So there's that primary step, and that's linked to how big a development do you want to do. From there, I think you should either go to the rehousing site or talk to someone who can give you just the highest level understanding of what you can do and a ballpark about how much it'll cost. And so it goes back to what Sam was saying right at the beginning. So it was something that we all realized as architects we could do. Like could walk into a house and say, you know what? Yeah, I think I could blow this out. I think I can add something here. I could put a laneway house in, and then on the back of a napkin, I could say, okay, that's going to be about $1 million worth of construction. Gee, how am I going to finance that? And by the end of the day, you could have a picture. And then from there, if you decide to go ahead, you start to very carefully add consultants to your team so that you can get some real information. So I think that's the most important first step, or first couple of steps, is to think about what you want to do. And it doesn't have to be, you could say, I'm not sure. I'm interested in finding out what's easier, what's cheaper, renovating or building new. I wonder how much that'll cost. And so by going to a site like rehousing, you can do that first bit of work yourself. If you don't use rehousing, then you need to talk to someone, a friend, hire an architect for a consultation, and just talk high level through a couple of those things. And you'd be surprised, I'm sure you know what that's like, Payam, that those first estimates, they're not 100%, but they're not 100% wrong.
That's
and it's
very true.
It's the first moment where you come to a crossroads. At the end of that afternoon, you could say, you know what, it's $1.5 million worth of construction. This is too big for me. Or you could say, it's $1.5 million worth of construction, but if I do a renovation, I wonder if I can phase it, because I could probably access X amount over 3 years, or I can handle $1.5 million and I see advantages to building new. It's a pivot point.
So basically define the project. Trying to put together a definition for the project. And if it's okay with you, I'm going to try and play the devil's advocate, and by all means, chime in, Sam. I'm going to try and be the client that I'm sure Janna has dealt with throughout her career that wants to maximize. So if I'm looking at an 80-foot lot, I'm going to come to you, Janna. I'm just going to say, or Sam, we're going through a website. Should I break it up? Should I make it 240s? Should I make it 240s and then should I push it to the max, go for 6+1 and then add something? Like what am I missing? What I should be thinking about? What are the do's? What are the don'ts? What are the overall expectations, and how do we go about that?
We'll be right back.
Just a quick announcement. The recent changes in the City of Toronto have turned multiplexes into a very interesting opportunity and playground for new developers. To that end, we're testing interest in something new that we think will help these new developers. We're considering a small, application-only developer cohort for GTA property owners and developers to help them start a successful multiplex project in 2026. Consider it as a training camp before the Olympics. You've already decided that you want to build a multiplex. You either have the property or are able to acquire the property within the next 90 days, and you want to ensure you're in top-notch form before you put your capital at risk and start the project. If this is something of interest to you or someone else you know, please go to multiplexinvesting.com and we'll provide more information. Thank you.
I think with any project, like almost even before you get to all of the things that Jana said, is actually taking a moment to evaluate what your vision and goals are for the project. What is it that you're trying to achieve? Because until you know that, you don't actually have a framework for evaluating the decisions that you're making around it. We have on our website, as part of the Citizen Developers Guide, a kind of getting started page. And one of the ones that I think is actually most interesting is the sort of like evaluate your situation. And it looks at the different sort of patterns of development, depending on whether you're going to live in it, whether you're doing this strictly as a kind of income generation piece, when you're thinking about, if you're going to think about phasing, depending on your budget. But I actually think a moment of personal reflection as to what your ambitions are and what you're trying to achieve with the project. Because I think depending on what your ambitions are, and if the ambition is to maximize the property, like one of the ones that you've said, I think that is an important framework with which you can then move forward to start to evaluate what's possible and what's viable. And I don't think that what's possible and what's viable are necessarily the same thing in every project. And keeping that in mind, I think it is an important.
Can you elaborate on that? Because that sounds pretty interesting. What's viable versus what's possible? Are you talking about the pro forma perspective?
Yeah, I think the pro forma perspective, the capability of the site to host it, like you might live in a ward where the city says you're allowed to build 6 units, but all you can build are like 6 very tiny studio apartments. And when you start to look at that within the whole picture, it maybe doesn't make sense from what you're trying to achieve, who the market is that you're trying to build for, and what the kind of return on investment you're looking for in order to make doing the project worthwhile is. And so I think you see a lot of people come into it and say, where they've said, okay, they said we're allowed to build 6 units here or 60 units along major streets. And each site, I think, has a really unique condition, that whether it's close to transit, if it's applicable for laneway development, if it's deep enough to accommodate a sort of sixplex plus one. And so I think really stopping and acknowledging first what the bylaw says you're allowed to build, but then taking the time to do a proper consideration of what actually makes sense on the site and not trying to force something that doesn't make sense.
That's very good advice. Sorry, Jen.
I was just going to say, I think there's almost like two kinds of citizen developers. There's the ones that actually have a good operating knowledge about things like what are the constraints and opportunities, and they'll come to Sam or me and they'll say, I've got this lot. They might not even own it. It might be an investment. And my goal is to do a sixplex, and I'm going to hold on to it and I'm going to rent it out, and I'm interested in maximizing the income I can get or something like that. And then that's one trajectory. And then there's the other kind, probably I would say the kind of citizen developer who might have inherited the lot from their parents or is interested in co-purchasing it with another person because together they can afford something. And they might have an idea that's like something like, we both want to live here and each have a rental apartment, and that's it. And for that kind of citizen developer, I think it's a more high-level conversation and I think that's where rehousing can help. Or I would say a very, honestly, an hour and a half with the right kind of architect can equip you with enough information that you can go away and then make that decision about what those next steps are. I think it shouldn't be an impediment if you don't know exactly what you want to do. It's about finding the right resources to help you articulate or show you the options that you actually have.
And I think just to jump on that, one of the things that we've been really focused on developing at Rehousing is an online web platform that helps evaluate properties to do a really high-level feasibility analysis, just to, before you have that conversation with an architect, to get a sense of what is realistic and possible on your lot. And so it takes all of the GIS, geolocated data around property lines and footprints, and then takes into consideration all of the zoning information and a few sort of baseline assumptions around building code, and does a kind of analysis to see, is there room for an addition? Does the house itself have room to divide and add a unit into it? And then it provides a really high-level financial estimate of what that work costs based on a kind of per square footage estimate. And I think one of the things we think is so exciting and useful about the tool is if you can look at it, understand kind of the range, like a sixplex or fourplex is going to cost versus renovating your house into a few units versus a laneway suite. And then you go talk to an architect, you know what lane approximately you want to end up in. And so you don't waste time or money on professional services walking down a sort of street that is actually like 4 times what you actually think you have to spend, but you can be really focused and come to the conversation with a little bit more background information and broader knowledge of what the whole process is going to look like to have a kind of more fruitful discussion with either an architect or contractor or a planner.
Perfect. And I think for our purposes, most of our audience would fall in the category of they're somewhat familiar with the industry. They want to try and get an investment. They're trying to get a project going, maybe their first project going. And I'm wondering if you have some rule of thumbs and in terms of general dimensions, guidelines, when it comes to, let's say, I'm just going to give a very exaggerated example. Like I know in parts of a city right now, you can go for, technically speaking, like you were saying, you can get sites that are 35 feet wide or 33 feet wide. And hypothetically speaking, you could also fit, or you're allowed to fit, 6+1 on that site. And do you have any rule of thumbs? Do you have any high-level numbers for things that people should be aware of? Yes, you could. And I'm approaching this from a perspective of, I'm looking at a site, I want to buy it, I want to try and put a price to it, because like you said, worst thing that can happen is that you buy something thinking you can get 6 or 7 revenue or rental incomes from it, and you end up seeing, you know what, yeah, I'm going to get the shoebox, which is not going to rent for what I'm thinking that it's going to rent. Have you had any experiences in your research that you say, you know what, if you apply these few rule of thumbs and you're probably good 50% or 60% of the time? Get to you, Jana.
We have conversations like that on a regular basis with clients or potential clients. And I would say we can do that. Absolutely. And we can give those rule of thumbs. Like I would say, so far, I'm thinking, Sam, I'll be interested to hear what you think. Like you need at least a 35-foot wide lot that's 100 and ideally 110 deep to get a sixplex now. So there are things like that. I think, and again, I'm going to just some narrative based in part on my own personal experience developing,
that's
being a citizen developer, is with that basic decision making, what I have learned is that there's a whole lot of knock-ons that impact that decision that you should know about before you pull the trigger. So one of them would be HST rebates if it's new versus if it's a renovation, and that's a lot of money. And going, if you say, this site says, look at the listing, it says it's as of right. So you buy it because you think it's as of right. And then you find out it's not quite as of right. Theoretically, it's as of right, but it's going to take you 8 months of approvals process. And that impacts your risk. And so I think it's a really good idea that when you're looking at the rehousing site, talking with someone, that you ask the other question, not only what can I do, is solution A or option A have impact or knock-ons that option B doesn't have? Because I'm sure, as you know, Brian, that it's very difficult to make a pro forma work. And sometimes those 6-month delays or having to not getting the HST rebate or having to put a transformer on your front yard can be the difference between breaking even and not breaking even. And we'll send you back because you might say, you know what, if you do a 5-plex, you don't need the transformer. A 6-plex, you need the transformer. We're talking about nearly $100,000. That has a big effect on the pro forma. So I think that's something where, although it's so tempting to put everything in silos, it's actually, you have to synthesize a number of different areas, because even if you're a citizen developer, you're still a developer and you're still subject to all of the complexities that Sam was saying at the beginning that anybody has when they're redeveloping a lot. And even just taking a bungalow and making it a 6-plex without demolishing is a redevelopment.
Thank you. Sam, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think Jana's intuition around 35 is definitely a much more comfortable lot with. We did a bunch of research around trying to establish what the minimum lot size for a 6-plex would be. And we found it was right around the sort of 25-foot dimension, but that's 1 2-bedroom and 5 very small studio apartments. And even that is going to be limited by which ward or which basically zone you're in the city, because if different zones have different regulations around how close you can build to the lot. So if you're looking for 6, I definitely would not look at anything under 25 because it's just the amount that you can build within the EHAN envelope. It's just not going to work for 6 units. I think Jana's intuition that going up to around 10 meters is where it starts to unlock a little bit more potential.
Perfect. Thank you. And to be honest with you, I think that's what we've also seen in the market from the projects that I've seen actually have happened, which means that they were able to somehow make the pro forma work. It's somewhere between 33 to 35, maybe 40. Those are the projects. And quite honestly, like the original example I gave at the beginning of the conversation is also moving toward that. If you have an 80-foot lot, you might want to break it up and make it 2 lots. And then at that point in time, you're making 2 sets of multiplexes. So these are the things that were not happening a few years ago. But these days, these are all the conversations that we're having with potential investors, from buyers and sellers, property owners. And I was reading something yesterday online that about the second type of citizen developer that Jana was talking about, that someone who wants to live there and just they're doing it for their personal use. And there was an example of a lady that was basically just retired, and she built something for herself in the back. And basically, she didn't demo the whole thing. They just added just enough for her and a couple of rental units. So she moved to the smaller unit in the back and now has two or three extra tenants, basically, which she didn't have before. And that's basically her retirement plan entirely. So that's a great outcome from my perspective. I want to go back to a couple of things that you mentioned. One is you're still a developer. Even if you're doing a sixplex, you're still a developer. And I want to emphasize on that because I also see that happen, unfortunately, more than I like to see it. And we have a great industry which has worked in the low-rise sector for as long as we've been here. In the single-family housing, custom housing, as a different layer of that same industry. And all of a sudden, when you get into a multiplex, we're seeing when we talk to people, it's not just a bigger house. And we've talked about this on this podcast before. It's not that you're building, I've built a 10,000 square foot or 15,000 square foot custom house, and now I'm going to build 15,000 square feet or 10,000 square feet of sixplex. It's not the same necessarily. Yes, you have a lot of transferable skills, which will help you down the way, which will save you costs. But at the same time, it's a different beast. It has a lot of nuances, which you probably haven't been involved in. So I'm very happy that you brought that up. And we emphasize that, like you said, make sure you have the right team. We have set up something on our website, some sort of an assessment close to yours that assesses the developer in terms of their readiness to take on a project and what they go through and answer questions, and they get an assessment report on what that outcome looks like. The other thing that I want to talk about more with you both is as of right, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about as of right. Does it mean slam dunk? Does it mean that if I buy a house, a parcel, and let's say those numbers work, let's say the 35-foot frontage and 110 feet depth actually is there, and I'm assuming that I can get 6+1, is as of right a slam dunk? I guess I start with you, Jana.
No, it's not a slam dunk. And I don't know about Sam, but I would say over the course of my career, for particularly single family clients, a number of them, or every once in a while we'll get one who said, I thought I could just do this, and now I find out I can't just do this, and it said it's as of right. So it's one of the really tricky technical terms, which is if you have an idea that aligns with the zoning, yes, that idea is as of right. What that technical term doesn't allude to is the steps that may have to come into play to make it as of right. So, for instance, you buy that 35-foot wide lot, but you want to go right to the property line on one side. Well, you have to go to a committee of adjustment to get approval for that. That costs you time and money, and there's some risk involved. And at the end of that, so what you know is when you go to the committee hearing, they can't say, I don't like a sixplex, because a sixplex is as of right. People can't turn you down because you're building a sixplex. However, they can turn you down for having a side yard setback that's 0. So you have to really understand what as of right means. And I hate to cloud the conversation, but I would say there are things that are as of right that don't include approval processes outside of planning. So this is, when they say as of right, that's from a planning perspective, it's as of right. Is it as of right or easily done from, say, water? No. Hydro? No. I would say things like, what else, Sam, are those other tertiary issues?
Site plan, I guess, access
Site
and
plan,
egress and distances, shadows, woodlands. I guess all those things would come into
TRCA, if you're adjacent to a TRCA. So again, I think it's about asking the right questions so that you understand the definition of as of right and maybe the 5 other constellation of approvals you have to go through.
Yeah, and I think as much as we've seen a lot of great movement and support towards multiplex development across the city, there are still lots of people, particularly in the suburban neighborhoods, who see this as a kind of like affront to them and their property value. And I think it's important to know that even that 3 inches past the side yard setback opens you up to feedback from the neighbor and the kind of expectation committee, even though it's not a requirement, but from most of the experience I've had is that you need to consult with your neighbors and have a discussion and get support in order to have your project be assured to be passed. And I think Jan is so right that understanding what that definition of as of right is, because if you're in a neighborhood where there isn't counselor support for this kind of development, you're opening up yourself to a massive risk by not falling within the box.
I was going to say, it kind of goes into, you have to be something Sam was saying earlier, is you need a certain amount of self-knowledge or institutional knowledge. Am I the kind of person who can't tolerate risk for whatever reason? Or I can tolerate medium risk, or I'm willing to tolerate a lot of risk if the payback is there. And that correlates to the conversation we just had, because you can, for instance, look at a site and say, I don't want to have any with approvals. Okay, what's the maximum I can build as of right? And with the tool on rehousing, you'll know what that is. And you can say, okay, I can build 4,000 square feet, 6 apartments at, 800 square feet or whatever, and have a kind of clear starting point. Or you could say, I can handle some risk. I don't think committee of adjustment so scary. I can add 6 months of time on, and then I can get, instead of 4,000 square feet, I can get 5,000 square feet. And so that's another way that you can start to measure as of right, correlate it to your capacity for risk. And I think at the end of the day, it's having those institutionally or personally, the self-knowledge to say, this is something within my wheelhouse. I can tolerate this. And then finding out what you can do within that arena of opportunity, because there's always good opportunities.
I would put everything you just said for my basic, simple layman mind that yes, a development, you're entering the development game. Yes, you got the check mark beside one of the lines, one of the many lines that says you have as of right approval for doing a multiplex. But that's not the whole picture, and it's not nearly close to being a very significant part of the picture. So if you're new, if you're trying to start a new project for the very first time, if you are lacking that institutional knowledge or background knowledge like Sam and Jana have been talking about, please be careful. What we don't want anti-hero stories to be trending, and hearing a lot of people have gone into this, I wouldn't say partially informed, with good intent, but not enough information or experience, and they've left a bad taste in everyone else's mouth. With that being said, I want to switch gears a little bit. Sam, when I was doing my research prior to the podcast, you've done some work about different partnership models and ownership models. Can we talk about that a little bit and how that might apply to the context of a citizen developer?
Yeah. So some of the research that I have done is looking at like alternative development models, what that means in terms of ownership structure. So we've been looking at co-ownership, particularly within the context of the multiplex space and multiplex conversions, as one of the big opportunities that this bylaw unlocked was the potential to lower the barrier threshold of access into the real estate market by saying, okay, what was once a single family home, with some modest renovations, we can actually make a home for 2 or 3 different households. And what that kind of structure looks like actually has a really big impact. And Jana, I think, would probably be the best person to talk to about conduising a small project like this, because it's something she's gone through herself. But we're also seeing now, I think a lot of these developments are happening in the rental space. There is an interest from not-for-profit housing developers who have scattered housing sites, who are looking at how they can make best use of the land. And then the other kind of ownership model that is of particular interest to me is a cooperative model, and what that means in terms of our financial system, which is relatively conservative, which can make going alternative paths a little bit more complicated. But we are seeing a little bit of shift in the financial space to develop a bit of appetite for non-traditional models. Co-ownership, I think, is one that it seems like there's been a little bit of movement on, and trying to figure out how to facilitate that. One of the major risks with co-ownership is the mortgage, and we don't actually have the ability to fractionalize mortgages in Ontario, or at least unless that's changed in the last few months. Could totally be wrong about. But which means that if you're co-owning with 2 or 3 other households, if one of them were to default on the mortgage, you're actually on the hook for the whole mortgage, which is why many people, I think, are interested in the kind of condoization piece where they can actually start with a joint venture for development and then each own their individual units as a kind of risk mitigation, and also working within the kind of the structures that our banking system is used to and understands. And generally, until there's lots of examples of things working successfully, big institutions are like big ships and they turn very slowly. And so, while we're starting to see a little bit of movement in that space, I think it's actually going to take some pretty serious investment on the financing side in order to unlock some maybe more exciting opportunities for alternative ownership models.
So I thank you very much. And I can share some personal experience and background. I come from Iran, and we had a different model back home. And it was basically a lot of construction happened on these 5-6-story buildings, mid-rise buildings, where you had a paid-off house and you would basically become a partner in the project. And someone else, the builder, would take on the construction cost. And eventually, whatever that number came out to be, or you could agree up front, and you would end up with, and we're talking 5 to 6 stories, somewhere between 5 to 12 units, maybe 15 units even. And that worked pretty well. It took probably 10 to 15 years to fine tune and calibrate and trust and make sure that everyone trusts in that model, because like you mentioned, it's a big decision for a lot of people. But a lot of, and I want to say probably 80, 90% of people who owned small parcels that were single family houses were very willing to participate into that model. And I know of people who are trying to do the same thing in Toronto or similar to it in Toronto. But I think part of it is the thing that you just mentioned, which is institutional trust and this process. And it's also, I think, a little bit of a cultural shift, which you need to be willing to partner up with basically become a partner with someone who you barely know probably on your house, which you've managed to pay it off. Let's assume that you've already paid it off if you lived there for a long time. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that? Do you see anything like that catching on here anytime soon?
Yeah, so it's something that I would love to see catch on anytime soon. There's lots of great models around Europe that we've seen replicated in other parts of the world, where it's like self-development or like development without the developer, where the people who actually live in the unit are the ones doing the funding and playing the role of the development, which can actually, in comparison to units developed in a traditional model, can reduce the sort of cost per unit, not insubstantially. And one of the big problems with the accessibility for that model is it requires a ton of upfront capital, and that makes it largely inaccessible. If you don't have between $200,000 and $400,000 in cash, developing your own building with a bunch of your friends is pretty difficult. I think there are examples around the world, like Germany actually has a bank that is dedicated towards these kinds of projects. So I think it will take the first couple of someone with probably a fair amount of cash trying it and doing it and demonstrating that there's a kind of like less risk in the model than the banks currently think there is, in order to start to see the tide turn. That would be my prediction, as we're going to.
So maybe that's the next frontier. If we have people here with that type of power, maybe that's the next frontier that we need to think about, because at the end of the day, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of these projects that I hear of or I know of, they're only happening because they're policy enabled, which basically we just talked about so far, but they're also somewhat subsidized through CMHC funding or CMHC providing or facilitating the funding, which is not which is not infinite. Like at some point it will finish. There's only so much you can do. So maybe the next step in this chain, if we're really serious about enabling these smaller projects, is figure out that financial vehicle, whatever format that would work between, and maybe that's already happening and we don't know about. I want to try and switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about Jana's experience. Jana, you've been an architect for quite some time, and you've also developed, and you've been a pioneer in what you developed. Can I ask you to elaborate for our audience? What was the project that you developed? Why was it pioneering? And then I want to get into lessons learned, do's and don'ts.
So we had wanted to, one of my business partners is also my life partner, and we've always been really interested in building housing that meets the needs of people that isn't being built. About 20 years ago, we built a house in Little Italy that was mid-block, easily convertible from one family to two family, had all green roofs. So it had almost 100% green coverage for the lot and was a very modest sized house, but because of the design work, didn't feel modest. And so it was far more affordable. So we did that and learned a lot of really good things. And then we realized that what was missing that interested us was this small scale multiplex development that for people who couldn't afford, like Sam was saying, $500,000 in cash to build, to have a place downtown that wasn't a tower, that we were very interested in creating gentle density that would create those kinds of units. And we could really see that kind of taller sprawl was creating a really bad, the inflections were really poor in some ways for the city, because either you got absolutely the social and hard infrastructures of a neighborhood were just crumbling from tower development, and yet in the suburbs, they were depopulating, and so they couldn't afford the social infrastructure. So we thought, okay, so let's develop like a small scale condominium. And we could really see that with all the more recent immigration, that new Canadians didn't have the expectations of a 4,000 square foot house with a back 40, that they were really happy to have a really well designed smaller unit downtown, accessible to infrastructure. And so that was the path that we decided to go on as really clearly we thought this was a demonstration project to show why, just like with the other house we designed, that if you bring good design to an initiative like this, you can create really good quality housing that has all these benefits. And we were really interested in living there, so that helped in terms of some of the startup capital, because we were able to contribute that. And so it was important for us that it was a condominium, because I'm not saying that rental isn't important, but there was a dynamic that was missing in the marketplace, which was small scale designed home ownership. And we started down that path. And for us, when we started, there was no multiplex zoning at all. It was totally a shot in the dark. There was a lot of challenges along the way. And one of the things we did, which really fit into the demonstration idea, was that we have a laneway house and 4 units in the main house. And actually, my partner and I live in the ground floor of the main house, and we live in the laneway house. And so we walk across a courtyard. And I can't tell you how many times people have gone, what? You have to go across a courtyard, which is covered, where you go across to get to your bedroom. And yeah. And then when they come over and they experience it, it's really transformative. But at the same time, it also works as its own separate unit. So it's easily, like literally over the course of a weekend, you can install a kitchen in the laneway house and it's its own unit. So again, it has that kind of flexibility for intergenerational. It also, if your kids move out, you can rent that out. So it has inherent in it some flexibility, or more flexibility than most of the things that you can purchase right now. And it's in a mature neighborhood without blowing up the infrastructure. So it means that your kids can go to a good quality school if you have them. At the same time, we wanted to demonstrate that it was possible to be carbon neutral in terms of operating. So we have an all-electric system. And we did all stick construction, which was really important because we wanted to build housing where people would want to stay. And so if you have a change in circumstances and you need to create a bedroom, you can do that with wood construction. You can't do that with concrete construction. And of course, wood is really great for carbon. So that was also really important to us. And then finally, we wanted to demonstrate that you could add that kind of density in a neighborhood without it being a density killer, so that your neighbors, it's important, and this is what good architecture does, is it allows for new changes to be introduced to a neighborhood, like in terms of massing and scale, without it looking like it's sticking out in a bad way. Of course, if you put a tall three-story structure beside a one-story, it's not going to look the same, but you can make it comfortable. And we wanted to demonstrate that because we could see that increased density was the future for downtown and the suburbs. And we felt good enough about our own abilities that we could demonstrate something like that by having some canny choices. And then finally, for us, we wanted to demonstrate, we had done a mid-block building the last time, and this time we wanted to demonstrate the values of a corner lot, of which there are many, just to be able to say, if you have a corner lot, here are the opportunities here. And I think to something Sam said earlier, what we can do as architects is demonstrate those opportunities that don't actually cost you anything, but increase the quality of life quotient and design opportunities. So that's why we did it.
Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. One last question on that topic. If you were to go back and redesign this building from scratch, what are some of the things that would you do anything different? Was there anything that you think we could have done better?
Well, one of the things we would do, because of when we did it, and we actually self-financed, we call ourselves reluctant developers. We didn't think we'd have to self-finance, but no bank would finance us, so we self-financed. And so our risk tolerance went down quite a few notches. If we were to do it now, we would have a single exit stair, not two exit stairs, because in working with Conrad Speckert, who I know you know, we modeled the difference, and we could have had another 100 square feet of livable GFA in each unit, which is huge when you're dealing with a small space. But we just weren't prepared to take that risk. The other thing we'd do is we would go to committee and go for variance in height. Right now, the basement unit is quite low to grade. And so even though we have a really generous light well and we worked really hard to make it really as light filled as possible, it's not as good as the upper units. And so I think we would raise the basement level even 1.5 feet, and that would have introduced far more light, and I think would have been a better solution. But again, we were very concerned about getting turned down at committee, so we didn't do it.
Thank you very much for sharing that. This has been great. And to Conrad's, you brought Conrad's name up. We've had him on the podcast here before on the mid-rise, and I've been waiting for a long time, and I'm hoping that it will happen soon, that we get the single staircase issue resolved, at least at a number of prototype projects, call it, which I think one of them is very close. And then that will set the precedence for other projects to be doing this. So to wrap this up, we have a traditional question on the podcast, and I'm going to start with Sam, is if we were to give you a magic wand, Sam, and would ask you to make a wish, only one, to improve the situation that we're in. It could be a wish to change a zoning bylaw, guideline, design, banking situation, law, regulation, you name it. Something that will help us deal better with the housing crisis, the affordability crisis, at least as it pertains to housing and where we live. Do you have a wish?
That's a loaded question.
It's meant to be.
With no prep. Oh, God. Oh.
Let's go for the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, I wish it was easier for people who are interested in doing this, particularly from the standpoint of securing more stable housing for themselves, to access the financing and unlock the financing to make these projects happen. I think we've seen great movement on the policy standpoint, but particularly for interested parties who don't have perfect financial situations but have great ambitions, I wish there was some vehicle that could support them taking on these kinds of projects.
Thank you very much. I think a lot of people share that wish with you. So who knows, maybe the genie listens this time. Jana, what's your one wish if you could make a wish?
I think with like Sam, I would say my biggest wish would be some kind of preferred financing system to allow people to participate in this area of work and to create more housing that's suitable, as opposed to grappling with performers that are so lean that if one thing changes, it's no longer feasible. And I guess the other thing I would wish for is that the authorities having jurisdiction, so the thing we were talking about earlier, that it's not just zoning, it's the water authority, it's hydro. It is a whole host that become this ecosystem that's a development. And my biggest wish would be that there is a centralized place that you can go to that, first of all, aggregates information from other developments so that if someone else has upgraded their water system, you don't have to. So you can cross that off your pro forma. But just also gives you the ability to really map out the whole process. Because again, at the end of the day, the risk versus pro forma robustness is so slim that any one of those things can really create a sticky situation. And it doesn't actually matter, I think, if you're a citizen developer or not. Those are make it or break it. And I would really hate to see people fail for a reason that doesn't have to exist.
Amen. Amen. That's not the first time someone had made that wish on this podcast about having a centralized system, having a more clear roadmap on developing, and basically you can't take it away, but you can reduce the amount of uncertainty that comes inherently with the development process, and also make it a little bit more viable, more interesting for people to jump on it. And again, like, this is all toward solving a problem. We have a problem. We need people to come in and solve it. And as we've said on this podcast before, we can't wait for our government. They're doing some stuff, but they have a lot of other stuff on their plate. And we need to be creative. Before we log off, is there anything that we haven't talked about or haven't asked you that either of you would like to talk about?
Just to add on to what you're saying, I don't think it's one problem that we have. I think we have several problems. And I think I would like to see the development industry and people working in the housing space start to look at this push for more housing as an opportunity to address not just the more problem, but also the better, from a kind of like more appropriate, better quality, better for the environment. If we're waving a wand, asking for things, I think we have an opportunity where housing is so front of mind right now. And it would be such a shame to waste this moment and build a bunch of crap. So I think acknowledging that it's not just one problem that we have, but it's actually many, and that each project isn't going to solve all of them. But if we can have a little bit of ambition to start to tackle some of those other problems in addition to just more, I think we would all be a bit better for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I appreciate both of you being here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for all the great effort. And I guess, Sam, just to wrap up, what is the best address for people to go to about the website, about the tool, and just maybe give us a 30-second teaser for people where to find the resources?
Yeah, you can check out our research at www.rehousing.ca, rehousing. And we have a whole bunch of interesting and exciting things on there. We have a citizen developer's guide. We have a catalog of ways to convert the 13 most typical houses in Toronto. We have a construction guide, which actually breaks down renovations into all of the different components and gives you a little bit more information and sample drawings of different pieces of those. And then we have our web platform, which we've developed for Toronto, which is at torontorehousing.ca. And it has 2 interactive tools that you can check out. The property analysis tool, which will give you property-specific information to get you a really high-level feasibility study for what potential there is to add a unit to your property. And we have a few kind of fourplex options on there to give you a hint at what's viable. And then we also have a quick budget tool, which lets you in just a few minutes get a really high level estimate of what a specific project type might cost.
Awesome. So pretty much if you're brand new, if you don't know anything about anything real in development, you go to Rehousing, we'll give you a crash course and we get you enough knowledge to be able to hopefully ask the right questions from the right people and potentially build a successful project. Thank you both ladies. It was great, very informative, and we look forward to talking to you hopefully in the near future.
Thanks for having us.
Just one last thing before you leave, please make sure to visit our website. We have put together a whole bunch of different resources that you can download for free from our website. These include checklists, manuals, and also access to previous webinars. In case you have missed any of our previous webinars, you can go there, get the replay link, download the slides, and benefit from all these free resources that we've gathered on the website. Please make sure to visit. Thank you.